Imagine winning a major war without firing a single shot, simply by parking a few ships in exactly the right place. You choke off a fraction of global trade, and suddenly superpowers are forced to negotiate on your terms. Welcome to the Claire and Horatio Daily World Brief, available at claireandhoratio.com. We are here to parse the civic stakes of what is happening around you. Today is June 20th, 2026, and we are unpacking a really profound geopolitical paradox unfolding in the Middle East. The United States and Iran have just signed a major memorandum of understanding to reopen global shipping lanes, yet almost simultaneously, a U.S. brokered ceasefire in Lebanon has completely shattered within 24 hours of its announcement.
Right, and the timeline of this shift regarding Iran really reviews the sheer scale of the disruption. Following the February 28 military attack on Iran by the U.S. and Israel, Tehran made the strategic decision to close the Strait of Hormuz. And that single action choked off roughly a fifth of global oil supplies, along with, massive amounts of liquefied natural gas.
Which is essentially like shutting down the only toll booth on a highway that 20% of the world's delivery trucks rely on. I mean, they can't just take a detour, so the goods start moving, and the economic damage just compounds hourly.
Exactly. The resulting economic pressure essentially forced Washington's hand. So now President Donald Trump and Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian have signed this new memorandum. To get that vital strait reopened, the U.S. is lifting its counter-blockade on Iranian ports. They are waiving sanctions to allow oil exports and beginning the process of unfreezing billions of dollars in foreign-held assets.
The strategic irony here is massive. The U.S. and Israel executed those February attacks, aiming for a decisive tactical military victory, with some factions openly pushing for a regime change in Tehran. But instead, Iran won the strategic long game by holding international trade hostage with a blockade. It's a vastly cheaper and, frankly, more effective weapon than any military offensive.
Well, we also have to look at the human reality resulting from these high-level strategic games, because the situation on the ground is incredibly grim. The U.S.-Iran memorandum explicitly calls for peace in Lebanon. But, as you mentioned, the ceasefire announced between Israel and Hezbollah on Friday is already dead.
And the mechanics of that failure are deeply entrenched, right? I mean, Israeli airstrikes, warplanes, drones, artillery have killed at least 16 people in the Nabati district just since the announcement.
Yes, Hezbollah actively rejects the deal, insisting they do not recognize the ceasefire terms, and Israel maintains its refusal to withdraw from the 5% of southern Lebanon it currently occupies. And first responders from the Red Cross in Nabati are reporting a devastating detail about the current conditions. The local medical infrastructure is so overwhelmed by the sheer volume of casualties that their ambulances are now bypassing hospital triage entirely.
Wait, they are bypassing emergency rooms completely?
Completely. They are driving victims straight to the morgue.
So, in the Middle East, we see how a single geographic choke point can hold the global economy hostage. But economic lifelines aren't the only things vulnerable to sudden geopolitical shifts. We are seeing an equally drastic shift in American foreign policy affecting a massive global health lifeline in South Africa. The U.S. administration is abruptly terminating a foundational pillar of health infrastructure there.
Yeah, the Trump administration has decided to end a program that provides $400 million a year in funding for South Africa's HIV and AIDS initiatives. This money flows through PEPFAR, the president's emergency plan for AIDS relief. To understand the stakes here, South Africa currently has more than 8 million people living with HIV, which is the highest number of any country globally.
And the justification coming from Washington is highly controversial. The U.S. State Department linked this defunding directly to allegations that the South African government is failing to protect the white minority Afrikaner community.
That's right. The White House is citing claims of a systemic white genocide, accusing South African policies of fueling violence against racially disfavored landowners.
Which is startling because international observers and the South African government firmly reject those claims as baseless internet-born conspiracies. The civic danger of allowing internet conspiracies to dictate global health policy and dismantle life-saving antiretroviral infrastructure is profound. How is Pretoria actually responding to this accusation, and how do they plan to replace that funding?
Well, Pretoria fiercely defends its domestic legislation, specifically its Black economic empowerment policies. The South African government views these as vital, necessary post-apartheid corrections to deep historical economic inequality. They're meant to integrate Black South Africans into the formal economy. They categorically deny the claims of systemic violence directed at white landowners.
And on the health front, because an abrupt cutoff of $400 million is a massive financial blow.
The South African Health Ministry insists they have been working on a self-reliance plan and that the provision of life-saving antiretroviral drugs has been funded entirely separately by their own national treasury. But regardless of their domestic capacity to absorb the blow, withdrawing a fifth of their total HIV program spending cements a severe diplomatic rupture between Washington and Pretoria.
Before we move on to how this unpredictability is impacting other regions, I want to remind you that for more daily briefings, brain candy explainers, and classic audiobooks, visit clarineratio.com. Now, this sudden diplomatic rupture in Africa is pushing other allies to realize how vulnerable they are. This anxiety over foreign reliance has triggered a profound panic in European capitals regarding their own tech and defense sovereignty.
That anxiety in Brussels really reached a new high after the U.S. government ordered the artificial intelligence company Anthropic to block all foreign users from accessing its top-tier software. Specifically, this restricts access to the Claude Fable 5 and Mythos 5 models.
Relying on foreign AI infrastructure is basically like renting a house where the landlord has the legal right to change the locks without notice. You can be evicted from the future of technology overnight. What was the U.S. justification for the block?
The U.S. cited national security concerns, noting these specific models are exceptionally effective at identifying vulnerabilities in complex software code. But this unilateral action immediately validated a viral doomsday thought experiment circulating in Brussels right now, dubbed Europe 2031. The scenario envisions the European Union collapsing economically because it failed to build independent AI data centers and compute infrastructure, leaving its industries entirely at the mercy of American tech restrictions.
We hear the term compute infrastructure thrown around as a policy buzzword, but what does that actually look like in physical terms?
In physical terms, we are talking about massive, warehouse-sized facilities filled with tens of thousands of highly specialized microchips known as GPUs. These server farms require gigawatts of electricity and enormous amounts of water for cooling just to function. Building them requires hundreds of billions of dollars and incredibly complex supply chains.
So Europe is attempting to catch up to avoid that 2031 scenario. They are launching a new Franco-German AI center, and the French AI firm Mistral recently reached a valuation of roughly $13 billion. But is that actually viable when single American data centers cost more than Mistral's entire valuation?
It's highly questionable. And to make matters worse, Europe's ambitions for technological unity are struggling exactly as their attempts at defense unity are facing similar internal friction. Germany has a booming defense budget this year of 114 billion euros, which is roughly $125 billion. There is a massive focus on autonomous drone warfare, with domestic startups like Helsing and Stark Defense securing major military contracts at the Berlin ILA air show.
But national interests seem to be getting in the way of collective European security.
It's exactly. Europe's flagship joint defense projects have effectively collapsed. The Franco-German next-generation fighter jet, known as FCAS, and the main ground combat system tank have both fallen apart. The root cause is bitter corporate infighting over intellectual property and project leadership between France's Dassault and Germany's Rheinmetall. Defense contractors are prioritizing their own patents and profit margins over building a unified European military apparatus.
This inability to unify the European defense industry is occurring at the exact moment the physical realities of the Ukraine war are shifting. The conflict is piercing borders that were previously thought untouchable.
Yes, on Thursday, a Ukrainian drone strike hit an oil refinery inside Moscow. Thick black smoke hung over the city skyline, and an 8-year-old girl was killed in the surrounding residential area. The physical war is breaching the psychological bubble of the Russian capital. Up until now, Moscow has largely been insulated from the daily realities of the conflict.
Is Russian state media attempting to spin the narrative, or are they acknowledging the impact?
They are frantically coordinating a uniform message across newspapers and television networks, insisting that Ukraine is suffering far more damage and that Russian strikes are more effective. They're trying to downplay it, but the psychological barrier of an untouchable Moscow has been definitively broken.
While Russia feels those direct physical strikes in its capital, Ukraine is suffering unexpected diplomatic friction with one of its most vital allies. The political alliances in Eastern Europe are proving highly fragile when confronted with historical grievances. Polish President Karol Nawrocki just stripped Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky of Poland's highest state honor, the Order of the White Eagle.
Right, and the diplomatic rupture stems from Ukraine's decision to name a military unit after the World War II-era Ukrainian Insurgent Army, or UPA. For Ukrainians, the UPA represents independence heroes who fought both the Soviets and Nazi Germany to establish a sovereign state. But for Poles, the UPA is a paramilitary formation responsible for the Volhynia massacres.
And those massacres involved the ethnic cleansing and murder of roughly 100,000 ethnic Poles between 1943 and 1945. Let me push on that dynamic, though. Why are these two nations, who desperately need each other for present-day survival against Russia, allowing an 80-year-old historical dispute to threaten their alliance now?
The Polish president stated that Ukraine's path toward European integration requires an honest confrontation with its history. You see, in Eastern Europe, historical trauma is not relegated to the past. It dictates modern politics. National identity in Poland is deeply tied to the memory of those massacres. This dispute severely undermines current EU integration efforts because it demonstrates that even an existential threat from a neighboring superpower cannot erase the borders drawn by historical memory.
So we are seeing nation-states bickering over borders, history, and intellectual property. Contrast that with the unprecedented borderless power accumulating in the private sector. The race for technological dominance is literally leaving the planet.
It really is. On Friday, SpaceX completed the most lucrative initial public offering in history on the NASDAQ. The company sold over 550 million shares, raising $75 billion and reaching a $2.1 trillion valuation. This financial milestone makes Elon Musk history's first paper trillionaire. But the civic implications extend far beyond the stock market ticker, because through a special dual-class share structure, Musk retains over 80% voting control of SpaceX.
Explain the mechanism of a dual-class share structure for us. How does a company go public, raise $75 billion from outside investors, yet the CEO essentially answers to no one?
A dual-class structure means the company issues different types of shares. The shares sold to the public hold economic value but very little voting power. The shares held by the founder carry super voting rights, often 10 or 20 votes per share. This effectively makes Musk an unfireable CEO. It allows him to pursue massive, high-risk, multi-decade goals without facing short-term pressure from Wall Street shareholders.
Goals which include colonizing Mars by 2030 and, crucially, placing massive AI supercomputers in orbit. Which sounds like science fiction? What is the actual engineering logic behind putting server farms in space instead of here on Earth?
It solves the two biggest bottlenecks for AI development: power and temperature. Orbital data centers would exploit unlimited, unfiltered solar energy available 24 hours a day in space. Furthermore, they would use the freezing vacuum of space for free cooling. On Earth, AI facilities require massive amounts of local water and grid power just to keep the silicon from melting. In orbit, those physical constraints simply do not exist.
But if an unaccountable individual launches the supercomputers that will dictate our global software into orbit, whose laws apply, we are approaching a reality where a private company controls orbital infrastructure, while traditional international institutions on Earth remain entirely gridlocked.
And that gridlock was fully on display at the latest UN COP31 climate talks in Bonn, which just ended in near farce. Nations like Turkey and Australia attempted to push a vital, scientifically backed target of reaching 35% global electrification by 2035 to systematically replace fossil fuels.
But a coalition of countries led by Saudi Arabia actively blocked language-affirming basic climate science, right? They refused to agree to wording that would base global policy decisions on the best available science.
Yes. This principle has been a cornerstone of these agreements for 30 years, but the coalition bogged down the talks by arguing over the influence of wealthy nations in the scientific process. The result was complete diplomatic paralysis.
The stories we have examined for June 20, 2026 do not share a single neat connecting theme. Instead, they demonstrate global pressures moving in wildly different, often contradictory directions. We see nation-states actively retreating into historical grievances and unilateral isolationism, whether it is Poland and Ukraine fighting over World War II history, or the U.S. dismantling health infrastructure in South Africa based on domestic politics.
And simultaneously, you have borderless technologies, from orbital AI data centers to autonomous drone warfare, accelerating rapidly, expanding far beyond the reach of those same paralyzed governments.
It leaves you with a critical question to consider. If a private company controls the orbital data centers that will power our future artificial intelligence, and our international institutions cannot even agree to put basic climate science on a piece of paper, who is actually writing the laws of the mid-21st century?
Thank you for listening to the Clara Narracio Daily World Brief. For more daily briefings and classic audiobooks, visit claranarracio.com.